Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
Welcome, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, where we discuss explaining, defending the faith with clarity, charity, and confidence. And I am Gary Michuta, your host and sensei for the next hour, and got an awesome show in store for all of you today. It is none other than our good friend Dr. Douglas Beaumont's going to be coming on the show. We're going to talk about, was Jesus a false prophet? And particularly, we're going to be talking about the Olivet Discourse, which, if you ever read the Olivet Discourse, it is interesting in that Jesus seems to be talking about the end of the world, and he assumes that those who hear, those who are actually listening to the discourse, will see the end. Well, if that's true, then that means Jesus is a false prophet, because the end of the world obviously didn't occur within that generation. So how are we to understand this? And this is something that trips up a lot of Christians, Catholics. I know historically some people actually lost their faith, looking at the Olivet Discourse. And so Dr. Beaumont's going to jump on the show, and he's going to help us work through this text and find out exactly what was Jesus talking about during the Olivet Discourse. So, hey, that's going to be a lot of fun. He's going to be coming up on the other side of the break. And, I want to say hello to everybody watching on social media, live stream on Facebook, YouTube. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the emojis. I appreciate it, folks. I also want to welcome all of you listening on radio stations across the United States and around the world. It's amazing to me that I get emails from all over the world that listen to Hands-On Apologetics via podcast. I imagine perhaps even live stream, for all I know. But that's really cool. Like I said, when I was young, it was a pretty big thing if we got a phone call from the other side of the country. It was a super huge event if we ever got an international letter. Remember how those used to look for, those my age? Be the super thin paper that would have stripes on the edges. And to get a letter would be pretty rare from, Europe or outside the country. But, man, with today, email, you can communicate with all sorts of people, across the oceans almost instantaneously. And so, I'm always tickled when I get emails from people who have listened to the show, watched the show, and have questions and so on. So I just want to welcome all of you, be on the other side of the pond, whatever pond that may be, to the show. Keep the emails coming. Love to hear from you. As always, we do our critical thinking skill every episode, and today's Finding the Fallacy is the association fallacy, which is kind of neat. And also, we meet an early church father. This early church father is was historically seen as a bad guy, although modern research is kind of finding out they actually wasn't as bad as history has portrayed him, at least as far as the available evidence. So, and that is, by the way, I almost didn't give you the name. It's Theodore Mopsuestia. That is the early church father for today. And lest I forget, let me also remind you, if you have any questions for Dr. Douglas Beaumont on the other side of the break, you can give us a call, toll-free, 888-526-2151. Say 888-526-2151. Or you can always send your emails, like I mentioned, to questions@handsonapologetics.com. That's the official website. That goes straight to me, folks. Questions@handsonapologetics.com. and I do answer emails. I try to answer all of them. Maybe not timely. I know there's a couple that's been sitting in my inbox that I really need to get to, but I've been working on 3 different manuscripts at once, 3 different book ideas, and a couple of them I'm getting near the end. I've been really pushing on them, so I've been neglecting the email. So my apologies to anyone who's listening that sent me an email recently. Haven't had a return. I will do my best to return your email. So I'm really excited about those manuscripts. I can't wait until we're ready to get them published. So they're on the way. So while we jump to the finding the fallacy, which is the association fallacy, which is an informal inductive fallacy of the hasty generalization or red herring type. Okay, as you know, if you listen to the show, fallacies are, there's many times not a very clear line between them. Some of them seem to be part of a family of fallacies. Many times fallacies will have multiple names. Well, with the association fallacy, it asserts by irrelevant association and often by an appeal to emotion that qualities of one thing are inherently the qualities of another. So there's 2 types of association fallacy, which are sometimes referred to as guilt by association or honor by association. But and we've talked about that. It's actually transference of value is also the kin in propaganda techniques. But this is a little bit more broad than I think just guilt by association or honor by association. It really tries to connect 2 things by something that's arbitrary or not really an important quality. Let me give you an example. As always, fallacies are much better understood through examples. The association fallacy occurs when, for example, I got this from Wikipedia. It's a good example. John is a con artist. John also has black hair. Therefore, all people with black hair are con artists. Okay, so that would be the association fallacy. Obviously, the color of the hair really isn't intrinsic to whether or not somebody's immoral or a con man, right? So you can't. So essentially, you have this hasty generalization, or even a red herring going on there. Or take this: Jane is good at mathematics, and Jane is dyslexic. Therefore, all dyslexic people are good at mathematics. Again, that would be the association fallacy. And that's our finding of the fallacy for today, the association fallacy. Now, let's jump to Theodore Mopsuestia. We got a lot to cover. Theodore was a student of with John Chrysostom under Labienus, the pagan sophist and rhetorician, and afterwards under Theodore of Tarsus, a great Christian teacher in Antioch. The friendship of Theodore with Chrysostom began already in the school days under Labienus and lasted throughout their lives. It was Chrysostom who persuaded Theodore Mopsuestia, who was not yet 20 years old, to enter a monastery in Antioch. And shortly afterwards, Theodore left, intending to pursue a career as a lawyer. That's kind of scary if you think about it. And it was Chrysostom, again, who, with 2 eloquent letters to his, quote, fallen Theodore, unquote, persuaded him to return back to the monastery. In 383 AD, Flavian of Antioch ordained Theodore to the priesthood, and in 392, Theodore became the bishop of Mopsuestia in Cilicia. Theodore survived his friend Chrysostom by more than 20 years, dying in 428. About 10 years after Theodore's death, Cyril of Alexandria, who was much involved in the Nestorian controversy, accused Theodore and Theodore of having been more remote but nevertheless guilty progenitors of the heresy of Nestorianism. Now remember, Nestorianism so separated Christ that he actually becomes like 2 persons, a divine person and a human person. Instead of one divine person with 2 natures. With suspicions voiced and condemnations leveled over the years, Theodore was finally condemned at the 5th Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 553, which the council issued the condemnation of the 3 chapters. And the celebrated 3 chapters, by the way, is a group of Christological writings by Ibis of Edessa, of Maris of Chalcedon, and certain writings of Theodoret of Syre, and also the person and writings of Theodore Mopsuestia were also condemned. Now, the writings of Theodore were quite numerous. In fact, some list as many as 60 writings that he produced, but we don't know the exact number. And for the most part, Theodore's writings are extant only in a multitude of fragments quoted by other fathers. So we don't have very much material, direct primary material from Theodore of Mopsuestia. And the loss is undoubtedly the result of the condemnation of the 3 chapters. Now, Theodore stands condemned of Nestorianism, and Nestorians themselves often appeal to him as their authority, regarding him as one of the greatest exegete. But obviously this can't be true because he was never formally a Nestorian. And the date of his death precludes that. In light of modern scholarship, it would be highly questionable whether he ought to be regarded as a proponent or even unwitting one of Nestorianism. And so modern scholarship, analyzing these fragments, are starting to cast some serious doubt as to whether he actually was a Nestorian. And part of the research has uncovered that the writings that were condemned at the council appear to be almost certainly spurious. They weren't his. So what they condemned was like pseudo-Theodore writings, not the actual writings of Theodore. And when scholars look at the fragments that do survive, it's not perfect because, his Christology represents kind of like the views of the time. It doesn't have the same razor-sharp precision as later times, but nevertheless, he's generally pretty orthodox in his Christology, although he does make a few mistakes. So that is our early church father, Theodore of Mopsuestia. And coming up on the other side of the break, we're going to have Dr. Doug Beaumont come on. He's going to talk about whether Jesus is a false prophet. How do you explain the Olivet Discourse? Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back with more.
This is Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio. This March, VMPR, in association with the Catholic Resource Center, will be hosting a special conference for the Adoramus Society. Adoramus at the Triduum, a conference on the spirituality of the Triduum liturgies, featuring speakers Father Joseph Fessio, Dr. Anthony Lillis, and Christopher Carstens, addressing such topics as developing a liturgical spirituality, the spirituality of Holy Thursday, the spirituality of Good Friday, and the spirituality of the Paschal Vigil and Easter season. It all takes place March 14, 2020, at the historic Sacred Heart Chapel at 381 West Center Street, Covina, California, 91723. You can register online at vmpr.org or call now at 877-526-2151 to reserve your seat today for Adoramus at the Triduum. Hebrews 11:3 says, "By faith we come to understand." According to St. Augustine, understanding is the reward of faith. Therefore, seek not to understand that you may believe, but believe that you may understand. May God grant us a strong living faith in Him and His divine plan of salvation, and help us to believe so that we may understand.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. 2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. And as we're getting our guest online, I want to talk about Dr. Beaumont's book, which is Evangelical Exodus, the Evangelical Seminaries and Their Path to Rome. You can find it on Amazon or just search it. You'll be able to find it. Evangelical Exodus is a kind of a cool book. If you're familiar with Surprised by Truth, which is a compendium of conversion stories, it's kind of like that. Basically what it is that there is a very prominent evangelical seminary. It's called Southern Evangelical Seminary. It was originally started by Norm Geisler, who is a very well-known Protestant apologist, and who, by the way, loves St. Thomas Aquinas. And he formed this group, which is a college or university. It's kind of a seminary, a group of higher learning, I should say, to train evangelicals to be able to go toe-to-toe with, modern-day atheism and all the other stuff. So it's kind of cutting-edge evangelical higher education. And something strange happens in this higher education, and Dr. Beaumont was part of that thing, namely that the students, through their research, started discovering Catholicism. And so, one by one, they swam the Tiber and became Catholic for different reasons, by the way. But nevertheless, it kind of sprung from this cutting edge higher learning thing. So what Dr. Beaumont did was he collected these stories and put them into his book, which is Evangelical Exodus, Evangelical Seminarians and Their Path to Rome. So I recommend it, especially if you love conversion stories and if you want to find out what was going on in this particular evangelical place of higher learning. Check it out, folks. It's available on Amazon and other areas as well. And I see that we have Dr. Beaumont with us. Dr. Douglas Beaumont, by the way, received his Ph.D. in theology from Northwest University and M.A. in apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. He's a convert to the faith and author of the book that I just mentioned, Evangelical Exodus, and other books as well. He's also a popular public speaker, a catechist, and director of religious ed. And you can check out a lot of his great articles and books and all that stuff at his website, which is www.douglasbeaumont, all one word, .com. And Dr. Beaumont, welcome to Hands On Apologetics.
Hey, Gary, great to be on.
Yeah, it's good to have you. I know you've been super busy with lots of projects, so I really appreciate it that you come into the dojo and talk about this today.
Oh, yeah. It's always a lot of fun, so I'm glad I got to be on again.
Excellent. Well, yeah, let's set up the problem. Jesus gives us Olivet Discourse, and, for those who have read the discourse, it seems as if Jesus is talking about the destruction of the end of the world, basically, right? And he also seems like it's going to happen very soon, maybe within one generation. So why don't we start there?
Yeah, sure. I've read about this prophecy in a couple of different places, and growing up, I was pretty much in churches that taught what's called dispensational futurism, which is a specific version of the idea that pretty much everything in the book of Revelation, the Olivet Discourse, and even a lot of Old Testament prophecies are still awaiting their fulfillment in our future. In other words, they have not taken place at times in the past, but are referring to the end of the world. And so this particular passage is the most famous in the New Testament for giving a lot of those details, the book of Revelation being the primary one, but it's so symbolic and everything that it really needs to be interpreted by other clearer passages. And so the Olivet Discourse that Jesus gave is really more of our didactical section from the New Testament. And in it, it's a chapter or a chapter and a half, depending on how you count it, answer to a question that the disciples asked of Jesus. And it's the longest answer he gave to any question. So this is a pretty important passage, and just to give a quick summary, and then we can dive into the details. This is the passage where we get the idea that before the end of the world there would be false Christs, worldwide like wars, famine, pestilence, all of this tribulation type language. In fact, the tribulation itself is mentioned. And even the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, stars falling from heaven. I mean, just this huge apocalyptic, cataclysmic type language, and all of it wouldn't really be that big of a deal, except that toward the end he says that this generation will not pass until all of these things have taken place. And up until that verse, you might just be thinking, oh, okay, well, this is, Jesus' version of John's book of Revelation. But when you get to that passage, obviously we seem to have a big problem there because, certainly a generation, couldn't be considered longer than, say, 100 years. I mean, even if people regularly live that long, if we narrow it down closer to the generation gap type thing, someone might see it as maybe being only 20 years or so. And there's some biblical indication that it should be numbered at 40. So 40 years is your typical generation calculation among a lot of end-time people. And so if we accept that and we see that Jesus is referring to the Olivet Discourse and all of its elements as taking place in a generation, well, then given that he said this around 30 A.D., all of this stuff would have had to wrap up around 70 A.D., and if we understand the passage in the way futurists typically do, there's no way that happened. And because they're kind of the loud minority of the Christian world, skeptics have taken it for granted that that is what this passage is teaching, and therefore Jesus was clearly a false prophet.
Yeah, I mean, historically, I understand that some pretty big-named exegetes lost their faith because of this particular passage. I think it was Lanois, back in the early 1800s, where they just came to the conclusion that, well, this just didn't happen. It's a false prophecy.
Sure, and we can see the difficulty even in evangelical apologetics. So, for example, one of my heroes of the faith, Dr. Ron Rhodes, who's written some of the best, anti-Mormon, Jehovah's Witness cult apologetics books out there. He refers to a prophecy of Joseph Smith, which is recorded in Mormon scripture, saying that the Mormon temple would be rebuilt in a generation. And he points out that didn't take place. In fact, it's never been rebuilt, so it's we're way past the generation mark at this point. But what I find fascinating is that Dr. Rhodes himself is a dispensational futurist, and he uses Joseph Smith clearly used the exact same language that Jesus did when he wrote this prophecy. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to see that Dr. Rhodes, correctly I think, takes Smith to task as being a false prophet for this prophecy of the temple being built. But when Jesus gives a prophecy, as we will see, of the temple being destroyed, suddenly this generation means something completely different, and Jesus gets off the hook. And I think skeptics rightly see that as a double standard.
Yeah, very good. And, that's a great analogy, too. Now, to help us kind of get the lay of the land with Protestant interpretations, you have the futurists who say it all takes place at the end of time. There's another view of the preterist. Can you explain a little bit of what they believe and how they're antagonistic to the futurist view?
Yeah, just there's nuances in all of these views, of course, but the basis of preterism is that many of these so-called end-time prophecies are actually very highly symbolic, apocalyptic, if you will, renderings of prophecies that were actually fulfilled in the first century, within about 40 years of Jesus speaking them. And depending on the type of preterist one is and the different elements that they throw into the first century, preterism ranges from a very orthodox, even Catholic view all the way up to complete heresy.
Yeah, right.
So we need to be careful. The so-called full preterists basically leave nothing for the future. Even Jesus' second coming is considered a first century event with nothing beyond it. So they've stepped over into heresy. But I would say that the more popular version of preterism takes things like the Olivet Discourse and most Old Testament prophecy and a considerable chunk of the book of Revelation as all referring to first century events, but leaves the final return of Christ in judgment that we affirm in the Creed for the future. And so they are solidly orthodox, but they are definitely, I would say, in the kind of minority of prophetic views, mostly because in the last century or two, this idea of dispensational futurism, from where we get the Rapture and the Left Behind books and virtually every end times novel that exists, has become so prevalent in America in the last 150 years or so that it's really just become sort of the standard view. And people outside the church typically are unaware that there are any others.
Yeah, and I've encountered, I know, just looking at popular media, futurists hate preterists. I mean, there are tons and tons of shows from Jack Van Ippy, I don't know if you're familiar with him,
Oh, sure.
where he will go after preterists as if, they're the spawns of Satan. So there really is a lot of animosity between these groups. It's not, something that is, scholarly tolerated, and, there's open dialogue between, there's some people who have stakes in each of those views.
Oh, sure, and preterists can be pretty mean-spirited as well, because they'll just look at futurism as if it's just completely stupid, and I don't think either view has a 100% binding grip on the truth. If we learn anything, I think, from especially Old Testament prophecy, if you pay much attention to the prophecies that someone like St. Matthew records Jesus fulfilling in his gospel, a Jewish skeptic would probably look at most of those and say, wow, you are seriously twisting Scripture here. I mean, some of these prophecies that Matthew says Jesus fulfilled were clearly fulfilled in the past. Some of them weren't even prophecies when they were spoken. It was just somebody talking about something that happened in ancient history, and all of a sudden Matthew's acting like it was a prophecy when it wasn't. And he's applying all of this stuff to Jesus. Even the virgin birth, I would argue, doesn't really have any clear reference to Jesus in the Old Testament, and in fact had to have been fulfilled within the lifetime of the prophet, or else Isaiah himself would have been a false prophet. So what we glean from this is that God's prophets often see more than what they are reporting, or rather, maybe we would say there is more than what they're reporting, but there's never less. Okay, so it's completely legitimate biblically to say that someone who says a certain thing is going to happen at a certain time period, if that doesn't happen, they're a false prophet. So we have to be able to deal with that.
Yeah, very good. We're chatting with Dr. Douglas Beaumont. More to come on the other side of the break. Listen to Hands On Apologetics. Stay tuned.
This is Terry Barber, and Myra Brown is with me. Myra, welcome.
Hi, Terry. I am so happy to be here with you today because I am up to something that I think you'll find very interesting.
Tell me, what is it, Myra?
Well, I want to give away a DVD, your famous 3-hour talk about how to share your faith with everyone. And do you know how I'm going to do it?
Tell me.
Well, me and my friend Annie Jo are calling everybody to talk about monthly donations, because that is how we keep this station alive.
Absolutely.
And so every person that answers either our email or answers our phone call will get that talk.
And they can get it by calling 877-526-2151. And just tell us how you heard about it, because I really am excited about Myra's project, because we want to have Virgin Most Powerful in every state in the Union.
Yep, and we're going to do it with your help. So answer the phone call, answer that email, and I look forward to getting your prayer intention then.
God love you. This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Dr. Douglas Beaumont on the Olivet Discourse, Was Jesus a False Prophet? And during the break, someone in the social media section of the dojo pointed out that I didn't know this, but a few days ago, Dr. Van Eppe died. So God rest his soul. So, Dr. Beaumont, yeah, let's talk about this discourse then. What was Jesus talking about if it wasn't the end of the world?
Well, yeah, I think, going back to the Old Testament prophecy, the one thing that I think as Christians we need to really be strong in maintaining is that if Jesus said that these things would happen in the first century, then they had to have, if he's a true prophet. Even if there is a secondary or double fulfillment, such as Jesus' first coming, there were several double prophecies concerning his first coming. It shouldn't be surprising if there are some concerning the second coming. So I don't have any problem with applying the Olivet Discourse to Jesus' final return, so long as we don't limit it to that and then say, that this prophecy did not take place in the first century. I think that causes problems. So I think the clue to the proper interpretation here is to start back at the beginning of the chapter. And what we see is that Jesus is walking out of the temple. They're all impressed with it. And he says, do you see all these things? There will not be one stone left on another that will not be thrown down. Okay, so, shocking Jesus statement. Pretty typical.
Yeah.
Well, then the disciples ask him, tell us, when will this be? Okay, what did he just talk about? The destruction of the temple. When will this be? So that's one question. And then they say, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, that could be a single question about a two-part event or two questions about two events. Doesn't really matter. We have two or three questions here. And what's interesting is that if you read the rest of the Olivet Discourse, which is Jesus' answer to these questions, he's pretty specifically naming each one of these questions in his answers. So, for example, a few verses down, he says that the gospel will be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Well, there you go. They asked him, when would the end be? And he tells them, it'll be after the gospel is preached to the whole world. Now, interestingly, this is a verse that is often cited by missionaries trying to get other people to be missionaries. I literally had someone come and speak to my college group one time and say, see, Jesus can't come back until the gospel goes to the whole world, and it hasn't yet, as if we're somehow holding him back, which struck me as odd at the time. But what's interesting is we need to remember, this is a different culture. These words mean different things sometimes. St. Paul says very clearly in both Romans 10 and Colossians 1 that the gospel had gone to the whole world. Now, clearly he's not using world here as referring to the planet Earth and every single piece of land and every single person on it. He's probably referring to the Roman world or some colloquialism like that. But regardless, whatever it is he means, if he means the same thing that Jesus did, then we already have the gospel being preached to the whole world in the first century.
Yeah. Yeah, and the word for earth, sometimes translated world, is ge, which is where we get the word geo for world, right? So it could be translated land, or it could be translated world, depending on the context.
Exactly. And of course, we know that Israel is the people of the land. I mean, the Bible calls them that. So I think that actually even further illustrates the fact that Jesus is really talking to the people right there in front of him. That's the way he uses the word this generation. All the other times that it appears in the New Testament, it's always referring to the people that are being spoken to. And of course, these are the Jews. These are the people of the land. So that's one important clue.
Okay.
He then gets to his coming, which he says there will be a series of events that will take place before he comes. And this is where we get the really heavy-duty language, like the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light, stars falling. And he says that then, after those things, will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. The tribes of the earth, or land, will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. So this seems like kind of a nail in the coffin of the preterist view. I mean, even if you want to twist things around and say that world only means the Roman world or the Jewish land, like St. Paul does, there's no way to get around this language here. Clearly, the sun didn't go dark and the stars fell out of the sky in the first century. But for those familiar with the Old Testament, they will see this as very clearly quoting typical Old Testament prophecies of what's known as the day of the Lord. And this isn't necessarily a single event. Isaiah speaks of this, Ezekiel speaks of it, Joel, Amos. This kind of language is repeated in the book of Revelation. Throughout the Bible, this imagery is used to express symbolically God's judgment on a nation, typically by being destroyed by a foreign power. And this, we will see, is exactly what happened in 70 AD. So, again, if we're going to let Scripture interpret Scripture and all that kind of stuff that we're supposed to do, when being read by an Old Testament person, someone who's familiar with these Old Testament prophecies, it would actually be quite odd if they took it with any degree of literalism, because in none of the previous cases was it literal. These other prophecies that were already fulfilled were fulfilled by invading armies, not by universal signs.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, if the sun ceased to give its light and the moon was turned to blood and stars fell from the sky, apparently it happens over and over again. It seems like an unrepeatable event, doesn't it?
Yeah. I don't know how many stars can actually fall to the earth. Scientifically, I'd say maybe one total.
Yeah, right.
About as many as you're going to get. Yeah, so to just kind of skip ahead to the another little troubling aspect of this, Jesus says he would be seen, again, with this seemingly universal type language. But just like you said, Gary, we got to keep in mind that the word that is translated world or sometimes earth here is referring to the land. It could refer to the Roman world, like St. Paul does. It could refer to just the land of Israel or Jerusalem, such as it shows up in biblical prophecy. So the question then is, okay, if we're going to interpret this passage the way the Bible itself seems to indicate we should, then what we really need to have happen is a foreign army needs to march on Jerusalem and destroy it. And for those who know your history, due to Jewish insurrection, the Romans indeed surrounded Jerusalem and laid siege to it in about AD 67. 3.5 years later, 70 AD, they broke through the walls, they invaded the city, and they destroyed the temple. Exactly like Jesus said would happen. They took it all the way down to the foundation stones. That's why the Wailing Wall is the only thing left. Of course, that's actually a retaining wall. It's not part of the temple. It's just kind of holding up the mountain that the temple was on. So 70 AD. Jesus probably said this in 30 or 33 AD. 30 plus 40 is 70. It happened exactly like Jesus said it would. In fact, when understood biblically in the way that I've described, this prophecy is so exacting that skeptics use it to date the Gospels after AD 70 to account for how accurate it is. So this whole thing, this incredible prophecy, I mean, this is something that should be shouted from the rooftops to show that Jesus is actually a true prophet and God himself, just gets completely ignored because it's been taken over by the futurists who see all of this as being end-of-the-world language only.
Yeah, very good. And you're absolutely right. I think if that didn't convince people that Jesus was a true prophet, I don't know what would, because Obviously, I mean, like you said at the very beginning, the apostles looking at the temple would think this thing would last for, generations, and it's a huge, huge edifice. And for Jesus to say, not a stone, will be upon another stone, it probably would have been incredibly ludicrous for anyone at that day to say something like that, because how in the world could that happen?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, God had David build Jerusalem like where he did and in the way he did for a reason. I mean, this was an incredibly fortified city. I mean, somebody like the Romans, who were, some of the greatest warriors, of all time, it took them 3.5 years living outside the walls before they could finally breach it.
Yeah. And also, so, Romans didn't destroy temples, too. Is that correct?
Typically, no. Yeah, the better thing to do was to march in with your standards, your own gods, and kind of plant them there, which kind of showed the superiority of your gods over the other gods. And Titus, who at that point led the siege, actually gave explicit orders not to destroy the temple, but his men did it anyway because they were just enraged at this point by the time they got in there. And they were also sacking it for treasure and that sort of thing. So, it ended up burning to the ground and being completely destroyed.
Yeah, that's another one too that makes the prophecy itself, I think, even more incredible. It's not only that who would be great enough to march into Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and would want to destroy the temple, because back then, the Romans, they would think the Romans wouldn't do that. They typically don't do that when they conquer nations. So who else could have been?
Yeah, that would be a pretty bad guess if you were just making up a prophecy. You wouldn't want to throw that in there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but nevertheless, like you said, it was 40 years on the dot. He sure enough, the Romans come and they destroyed the temple, and I think it was on the same day as the first temple was destroyed.
I've read that also. I'm not 100% sure myself, but there's some very interesting numbers that go on there. So I think what the last kind of troubling aspect is just this idea that Jesus would be seen. Now, we don't have historical records that anybody actually saw Jesus coming on the clouds. Of course, he threatens the churches of Revelation with this. So this doesn't necessarily, just because Jesus comes in judgment, that doesn't mean it's the final return, any more than it would have if he had come in judgment to the churches in Revelation. But what's interesting is that even if you just ignore that part for a moment, we need to remember that at this point there were no Christians living in Jerusalem. Josephus, the historian, actually records that for no known reason, the Romans withdrew the siege for a period of time before they came back and kind of got it started again. And during that time, the Christians who had heeded the Olivet Discourse fled Jerusalem, which I think explains a really odd passage. Jesus says in the Jewish Gospels that when you see the abomination of desolation, you're to flee the city. But what
I hear the music. Why don't you hold it there? And when we come back, we'll talk about that particular passage. We're chatting with Dr. Douglas Beaumont. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics. We'll be right back right after this, folks. Stay tuned.
Hi, this is Terry Barber. I want to share with you a wonderful program called The Legacy of Love and Devotion. Well, what is it? Well, it's where you share your life and love of your Catholic faith with your family for the next century and beyond. Let's face it, our Lord is going to call you home at some time, and how are you going to evangelize your relatives in the future? Well, by coming into my studio via telephone call and telling your story of how you love Jesus and Mary and the church, and giving information to your grandchildren and beyond their love for the Catholic faith. How does it work? I'm going to tell you more if you call me on my cell phone, 661-972-7872, and I'll give you all the details of how you can pass on your Catholic faith to the next generation and the following generations. It's a very unique program. I want to tell you more about it. Call me at 661-972-7872. God love you.
Jesus said in Luke 17, "When you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are unprofitable servants. We have only done our duty.'" According to St. John of the Cross, God is pleased with the little deeds we do in secret. He takes more pleasure in these than in a multitude of grand works that we may do out of the desire to be seen by others. May God help us to do the things that please Him, and not just to appear great in the eyes of others.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. We are chatting about the Olivet Discourse, whether Jesus was a false prophet, and Dr. Douglas Beaumont has given us some great understanding of that passage and how, no, it is not only true, but an incredibly remarkable prophecy at that was fulfilled. And I'm sorry, Dr. Beaumont, right before the break, you were talking about a remarkable fact that no Christians were killed during the siege in Jerusalem. And you were just going to tell us about another prophecy in Scripture.
Yeah, what's interesting is that in the Matthew version of the Olivet Discourse, he says, "So that when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Now, if we understand what is going on here, Jesus is referring to an event that had taken place, again, already a couple hundred years before. But just to jump ahead, when Luke records the Olivet Discourse, he doesn't talk about the abomination of desolation because Jesus literally says he expects the readers to understand his reference to Daniel. Luke is not expecting that. So what he does is he essentially translates it for his Gentile audience, and he says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies." Okay, so apparently Jerusalem being surrounded by armies and the abomination of desolation are connected. But what always seemed weird to me is that he says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then flee the city." Well, That's too late.
Yeah, right, yeah.
The whole point of surrounding a city is so that nobody can escape.
Right.
So it's like, well, thanks, Jesus. How about maybe before it's surrounded by armies we escape? That makes a little more sense. But again, Josephus records, and this is, this guy is a Jewish turned Roman, pagan, so, no friend of Christians. He records that for no known reason, the Roman general withdrew his armies for a period of time and then came back right in the middle of this siege. And what that did was it allowed Christians to see the army get surrounded, get ready to leave, and then when they withdrew, the Christians took off. And so by the time the city was surrounded a second time, there was no more escape. But at that point, there were also no more Christians. So whatever happened at Jerusalem would not have been recorded by anybody in the city because they were being slaughtered, and they certainly were not Christians. But what is interesting is that the same Josephus records that there were armies seen in the clouds in his book, The Wars of the Jews. Right. And likewise, the Roman historian Tacitus records the same thing in Histories. So while they don't actually say, Jesus, the Christian Messiah, showed up, the fact that they saw an angelic army in the clouds is pretty impressive testimony from people that were not expecting it and certainly would not have believed it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm familiar with Josephus. I didn't know about Tacitus. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's Histories, Volume 13.
Okay. Yeah, and if I remember correctly, Josephus kind of relates it like, you're not going to believe this, but this is what happened.
Yeah, and of course, then people are going to say that it's not his writing and blah blah blah. But anyway,
yeah.
The point is that all of this is there, and we can. We can go back through the details. I mean, if you kind of using this framework, if you sort of see the bookends, the Olivet Discourse begins with questions about the temple. It ends with the temple being destroyed within a generation. That main arc is very easy to prove historically. It definitely happened, and it definitely happened when Jesus said it would. The end. Now, to go back through these, 30 or 40 odd verses and go through every single detail and say, okay, this is exactly what its fulfillment was in the first century. That can be done as well. That level of detail is probably going to be more demanded from futurists than from skeptics. But even then, it still plays out pretty well. I mean, we have a number of testimonies about false Christs showing up in the first century, beginning in the Bible itself. Of course, wars and rumors of wars, I mean, that's not even a very noticeable sign for back then. But during the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, it actually was kind of an unusual thing to happen. Rome brought peace to the empire. Now, it did it using war, but at this time, this was still happening. Of course, you have earthquakes. There's plenty of them, famine, sickness. I mean, Josephus spends an incredible amount of time talking about the horrendous famine and sickness and just psychotic things that went on in the siege. I mean, you have mothers roasting their own babies and people eating dung. This wasn't just like a sad day for Israel. This was, some of the worst things that any human have ever experienced. Yes. And when you couple that with the fact that, yes, the gospel did go to the whole world in some sense, biblically, and that all of these heavenly signs did occur, again, if we understand them the way the Bible means it, well, then there really isn't any trouble concluding that the entire Olivet Discourse, everything that Jesus said would happen, did happen when he said it would happen.
Yeah, very good. Now, are you of the opinion that it's there isn't any kind of secondary fulfillment? Is there a possible future fulfillment within this, first century prophecy?
No, I think that there's going to be more, not so much because of the prophecy itself. In other words, I don't think there's anything in the prophecy that implies or demands any kind of future fulfillment. But rather, because the church has historically taught that some of this, or at least they use this kind of language to talk about the return of Christ, then there's certainly no problem with there being a double fulfillment.
At least like typical, typological.
Maybe, that they may be completely literal in some sense, but they might also just be typological. And, again, if we look back at the way Matthew handles Old Testament prophecies with Jesus' first coming, it almost becomes impossible to even guess what a double fulfillment might look like.
Yeah.
Because again, if you read about, Jeremiah 31, Rachel crying for her children, has nothing to do with what Matthew applies it to in the New Testament. Hosea 11, out of Egypt I called my son. That's very different than Jesus' family, just riding a donkey out of Egypt. Reading Isaiah 7:14, reading Jeremiah 31, Hosea 11, I don't think anybody would read that and be able to even fathom what its double fulfillment was going to be like. So I don't deny the possibility of a double fulfillment. In fact, I think it likely, because it would just make sense given the way God seems to like to do things.
Yeah, right.
But as far as then using the fact of a future fulfillment as a means of guessing the time, much less date setting, or trying to write out an elaborate, detailed, step-by-step, tribulation map for the future, the history of biblical interpretation just really doesn't warrant doing that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Very good. In fact, one thing I wanted to ask you is Jesus gives this incredible prophecy of the destruction of the temple, and it's recorded in the Gospels. But you don't find in the Gospels, and this was fulfilled in 70 AD. Now, someone could say, well, if this really was a prophecy that was fulfilled in 70 AD, one generation later, why don't we see that connection being made in the Gospels themselves?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I mean, the biblical authors, especially Matthew, right, had no trouble pointing out, oh, this was in fulfillment of this. This was in fulfillment of that. So it would be really odd for Matthew to write his gospel in, say, 90 AD and then not say that. The book of Acts makes no reference to the destruction of the temple. Of course, nothing in the New Testament makes any reference to the destruction of the temple as a historical event, which is why a lot of people have dated the entire New Testament to being written in the 60s. I remember when I was in seminary, I always found it odd that my mentor, Dr. Geisler, would use the fact that the temple's destruction wasn't mentioned in the Gospels to date them early, but then he would use the fact that it wasn't mentioned in Revelation to date it late.
Wow.
Wait a minute, in my New Testament class, this argument went a completely different direction. So, yeah, historically, the actual arguments for the late dating of even the writings of John and stuff, they're actually fairly weak. And interestingly, they're based more on historic tradition than the text itself. Which I find fascinating, that again, these dispensational futurists will completely ignore history and tradition when it comes to the order of the Gospels and Markan priority and these sorts of things.
Right.
But then all of a sudden, when it comes to Revelation, which they need to be written in the 90s in order for futurism to make sense, all of a sudden, all of that stuff just goes right out the door, and they base it on one statement from Irenaeus, and suddenly it's just obvious that the book of Revelation was written in the 90s. So, I think there's a bit of inconsistency there.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I was curious what your opinion was. I think it was A.T. Robinson wrote a book redating the Gospels, and his primary argument was the silence about the fulfillment of the destruction of the temple. And that always struck me as an excellent argument. Though it's an argument from silence, the fact that the gospel writers neglected to mention the fulfillment of it, that's just hard to swallow. I don't even know if there's any alternative explanations.
Yeah, and the idea that Matthew just kind of made this prophecy up to make Jesus seem legitimate is kind of ridiculous, given the resurrection.
Yeah, right.
It's like, well, we got this guy, we got him walking on water, we got him changing water into wine and raising himself from the dead. But man, if we don't get a prophecy in here, no one's going to take him seriously. It's like, come on. That seems a bit of a stretch.
It does. Wow. Well, I can't believe our time has flown. Where can people go to, get your writings, your articles, your books? Is there a one-stop shop for all your
There is.
work?
If you just go to DouglasBeaumont.com, I had to use the formal form of my name because DougBeaumont.com is some realtor. DouglasBeaumont.com, you'll find everything there. The two articles that would be of interest in this discussion, fortunately they're long, but they're all in one place, is a first-century fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse. And then the other one is actually called Of Acorns and Antichrists.
Okay, yeah, great.
So I think between the two of those, this position is pretty well established.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. This is a lot of fun.
Always great, Gary. Thanks a lot for having me on.
All right. That's Dr. Douglas Beaumont, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, check out his stuff at www.douglasbeaumont.com. He has lots of great articles on that website. Check it out. And especially if you're talking to someone about, that's interested in end-time prophecy, point them to those articles. It's great. All right, well, it's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center here and turn off the dojo lights. I want to thank everybody for listening to the program and joining us today. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. And God willing, we will talk again tomorrow. So everybody have a great day, and bye-bye.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. listening to cassette tapes transformed by daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.